Let's begin with an overview of climate physics, at least enough to prepare you for the next section on paleoclimate. Here is an overview of the structure of the atmosphere. It's conventional to divide the atmosphere into a number of layers based principally on the vertical gradient of temperature in those layers. Beginning at the bottom, we have the troposphere, where the temperature decreases quite rapidly with height. The troposphere extends from the surface to an altitude of anywhere between 10 and about 18 kilometers, depending upon latitude and time of year. At the tropopause, which can often be quite abrupt, the temperature ceases to fall appreciably with height. And in the lower stratosphere, the temperature is approximately constant with height for the first 10 kilometers, and then increases up to the stratopause, which is generally located just below 50 kilometers. Above the stratopause, the temperature again decreases with height in the mesosphere to the mesopause around 85 kilometers altitude, and once again the temperature increases in the thermosphere. Now, about 80% of the mass of the atmosphere is contained in the troposphere, and most of the rest of that is in the stratosphere. By the time one gets up into the mesosphere and thermosphere, there's hardly any mass at all. The thermosphere is hot principally because of the interaction with that part of the atmosphere with highly energetic particles that originated in the solar wind. The mesosphere and thermosphere are not important for climate physics, and we won't be discussing them further in this course. Most of what we will talk about are processes that operate in the troposphere and to a somewhat lesser extent in the stratosphere. We have to always remember that our atmosphere is thin compared to the radius of the Earth. Here is a picture from one of the space shuttle missions showing moonrise over the Earth with the sun having illuminated the atmosphere, and this simply gives the appropriate impression that our atmosphere is very thin compared to the radius of the planet. Let's talk a little bit about the climatology of the Earth's temperature. Here is an animation showing the surface temperature at various months of the year. By looking at this animation, one can see that the entire belt of temperatures migrates north and south with the seasons. You can also see in this chart that the most extreme variations of temperature over the year are in the high latitudes of the northern hemisphere. The tropics, on the other hand, have almost constant temperature. In fact, here is a chart showing the annual range of temperature in degrees centigrade, illustrating that the largest annual variations are over the northern hemisphere continents. In places like Siberia, the annual range of temperature can be well in excess of 50 degrees C. On the other hand, as we stated before, in the tropics, annual variations of temperature are in many places less than 3 degrees centigrade. Here's a map showing satellite measurements of sea surface temperature, with the red colors indicating relatively high temperature and blue relatively low. There's a lot of interesting structure in this chart. This is not a climatology, it's a snapshot of the sea surface temperature. And notice right away some interesting features. As we would expect, generally speaking, the highest temperatures are around the equator, but there are places, here for example, right along the equator where the temperature is locally a minimum. One can also see a belt of minimum temperature right along the equator in the Atlantic. Later in the course, we'll be talking about features like this. Let me also point out this narrow ribbon of high temperature off the east coast of the U.S. This, of course, is the Gulf Stream. There's a similar but weaker feature off the east coast of Asia that you can see here called the Kuroshio Current. There are all kinds of interesting features in ocean currents and temperature, which we'll talk about later in the course. Here's a chart simply showing the longitudinally average surface temperature in January, given by the dashed line here, in July, given by the dotted line, and in the annual average, the full line that you see here. Clearly, this chart shows the very low variations of temperature around the equator and the relatively high variations of temperature in the northern hemisphere, particularly at high latitudes, relatively low variations of temperature in the southern hemisphere. As you might guess, the high variations of temperature in the northern hemisphere are owing to the concentration of land in that hemisphere. The prevalence of ocean in the southern hemisphere keeps that hemisphere relatively stable over the year. Let's talk a little bit about the composition of the atmosphere. Most of our atmosphere is comprised of molecular nitrogen, which makes up about 78% of the atmosphere, and most of the rest is oxygen, comprising about 21% of the atmosphere. Argon comprises about 0.9%, and everything else is a trace constituent. Water vapor, as we'll see, is highly variable, but on average comprises just 0.25% of the atmosphere, and carbon dioxide, which we'll talk about quite a bit, is really a trace constituent at 0.04%. Let's just look at this in tabular form. Once again, we see that nitrogen comprises most of the atmosphere, 78%. When we get down the chart, we see that gases like carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and ozone comprise tiny percentages of our atmosphere. Surprisingly, they turn out to be incredibly important in controlling the climate. This is simply a chart that begins to illustrate the variability of humidity. This is simply showing the concentration of water vapor with altitude. Let me just mention that the principal gases that comprise the atmosphere, oxygen and nitrogen, have constant concentrations through the troposphere and stratosphere. But water vapor is highly variable. Here one can see that in the tropics, 10 degrees north to 10 degrees south, water vapor decreases exponentially with height, being far less at 10 kilometers than it is near the surface. In the mid-latitudes, 40 to 50 degrees north in this case, one has a lot less water vapor. It too decreases approximately exponentially with height. And in very high latitudes, of course, you have less water, still also decreasing rapidly with height. Another gas whose variation with altitude is important is ozone. Here we see that ozone decreases with height in the troposphere, but begins to increase in the stratosphere, reaching a peak between 25 and 30 kilometers, and then declining above that altitude. Later we'll see that ozone absorbs much of the ultraviolet part of the solar spectrum, and that heats the upper stratosphere, which is in fact why the temperature actually increases with altitude in the stratosphere. Some of the gases in our atmosphere are also varying in time. Here is a chart showing the variation of carbon dioxide as measured at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. The red lines show the continuous measurements of carbon dioxide starting in 1958 and going up to the present. You'll notice that these little squiggles here have a period of exactly 1 year. Carbon dioxide fluctuates seasonally. It reaches a peak in Northern Hemisphere winter and a minimum in Northern Hemisphere summer. This is a graph showing that the planet breathes carbon dioxide in and out over the seasons. During the spring and summer, Northern Hemisphere foliage comes out, absorbs carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and then when the leaves fall and decay, that carbon is returned to the atmosphere in the fall. On top of the annual cycle of carbon dioxide, one can see a continuous upward trend in this gas, beginning in 1958 about 310 parts per million, but increasing to just about 400. In the year 2013, we for the first time exceeded 400 parts per million. This is a very large percentage increase in carbon dioxide, largely responsible for driving the phenomenon known as global warming. Another gas that changes in the atmosphere is methane. Here is a time series of methane going back to about 1979, showing that it too is increasing and it too has an annual cycle. Unlike carbon dioxide, the increase in methane has been slowing, although since about 2006 it's beginning to increase again.